Welcome, everybody, to another Village Torah session. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew. We are in the parasha of Ki Tavo, which is one of the parshiot, one of the Torah portions in the book of Deuteronomy. And what we've been experiencing throughout the book of Deuteronomy has been a lot of recapping, sort of going over a lot of summaries of sometimes just duplication that we experienced a lot in last week's Torah portion. And I think I mentioned last week, there is so much just in last week's Torah portion of Ki Teitze. It's chock full. We could do so much comparison, all these different things. This week's Torah portion is a very different parasha in the sense of we don't have a lot of necessarily little things. There's sort of big chunks going on in this week's Torah portion. In fact, in the sort of the back portion of this week's Torah portion is a whole bunch of sort of blessings and curses, sort of just these huge packages of blessings and curses. I'm not going to go into that. That is definitely a very long study to go into, but and then really interestingly, there just another thing that you could look into, who knows, maybe we'll do it next year, is talking about the part of the tithing system. We don't usually talk about tithing, sort of giving of donations, but that's another topic. But this one, what I do want to talk about in this week's Torah portion is about this thing called Bikurim, or first fruits. Now, when we start going through it, it actually will sound very familiar. So now, even though the topic may not be familiar, it's going to be familiar from, well, I'm just going to spoil it for everybody. We actually come across it in the Haggadah. So,
Oh,
yeah, I know. So this is something that we usually counter not this time of year, but in the springtime in reading the at least the traditional Haggadah. So this is a rare opportunity actually for us to think a little bit about Passover and the Seder night in the summer. For anybody who wants to follow along, right here in chapter 26, right here at the outset, and I am going to slowly read it for us. Okay, and as we'll notice, actually, it's called Ki Tavo. The parsha is called Ki Tavo, which literally translates to when you enter. Okay, so here we go. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. And here's what you're going to recite. My father was a fugitive Aramaean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And I like to translate it actually as oozing of milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. You shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God. And you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst all the bounty that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you and your household. So that's how we kick off this week's Torah portion. That's the opening section of this week's Torah portion, is this Bikurim. Now, when we talk, Bikurim literally means first fruits, but it really comes from the root of Bechor, of not just fruit. It is first, but there's also this it's like this specialness going on. So I do want to just make a quick comment. So this language of a land flowing with milk and honey, so it's in the Hebrew, it's here we are. Actually, it's here. So it's Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. Last year, we actually went into this topic. So I'm going to be sharing that video this weekend. But these four words, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. So it's a land. With the Eretz is a land. Zavat, it's flowing. It's like oozing, but it's more of an oozing than necessarily like when I think of a flow, I think of a river, the flow, the mighty rush, the flow of a river. But this is more of an ooze, like you would see. Well, as we're going to see, chalav udvash. So these two words are milk and honey. Now, the milk here is like you'd find in either cow or usually they're actually usually talking about goats here, their milk, and then dvash, which is honey, but not bees' honey. It's more of honey that one would find in either dates or figs, and so it's sort of like that honey that would ooze out of fruits. So it's whatever you would have coming out of that. So that's just an interesting imagery and maybe even appetizing, delicious imagery. And that's the point, because what we experience here in this opening section of this week's Torah portion is about the bounty, the harvest, and really this first fruits, right? These first fruits. And we're, I want to say the farmer. Now, back in those times, it wasn't necessarily restricted just to farmers who were harvesting. It was that was pretty much what everybody did. People harvested. That's how they had food. But for us, we think of the ancient biblical farmer, but for them, it was really almost pretty much everybody. And when you did your harvest, you got your stuff, right? But you don't just, pick it or however you harvest and then just eat it. What is really neat here, and it is again this land flowing with all these wonderful things. But it's really, it's interesting. There's a whole story going on. It's not just simply lacking context of, oh wow, look at these first fruits. It's we had this winter and all of a sudden there are fruits. This is amazing. No. It's there's this really contextualizes everything. So we have, even when you enter the land, right? So even just the way we kick off, this is what's going to happen. And it's very exciting, right? Moses is telling the Jews, the Israelites, Bnei Israel, you're going to go there. You're going to enter it. And don't think you're just going to plant and be your own self and harvest. No. There has to be, I don't know if you can see up top here, but there has to be an attitude of gratitude. There has to be a thankfulness going on, and also an appreciation for God. You got us out of Egypt. You caused us to survive all the way through the desert. And when we get to this land, when we get to our land, this will be great. This will be wonderful. And these first fruits, we got to give it to you, God. We got to hand it to you. We're going to bring this basket, right? You shall take from some of your every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Again, that is speaking to context, right? The context that this land didn't just come out of nowhere, but actually God gave it to us. And so we take it to the place where where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name, right? So, which ultimately ends up being Jerusalem. We take it to the priest and we make this declaration. Now, if this declaration sounds familiar, right? I acknowledge this day before I've entered the land. This is wonderful. The priest shall take the basket, set it down, and then here is the recitation. Now, the recitation is might be very familiar to some of us, which is this, my father was a fugitive Aramean, right? What we read before sounds very strikingly familiar. It's shockingly familiar because we commonly encounter it, at least in a more traditional Haggadah that we would read on the Seder night, which really goes far back, right? And think about this. Moses now is addressing the generation of Jews about to enter the land of Israel. So, but he talks about, my father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, and he became a great and very populous nation. Moses right now is addressing those about to enter the land of Israel, saying, you have a past, you have a historical context, and this land isn't just, whatever happens to be in front of you. No. This land is has a very special part in our people, and more importantly, our people's history and identity and our heritage. And so we have this whole historical contextualization of these fruits. I mean, it sounds kind of amusing that all of these fruits, that all this history, all this this contextualization is coming about because of a basket of fruits, which is it's like like Jewish farmers have to be know their history as a people, just for handing in a basket of fruits. But so knowing that we went down to Egypt, went down with meager numbers, all that. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us. We had heavy labor. We cried out to God. He freed us, and then we have these words that I think many sometimes we kind of joke about, right? Because what we talk about here is the Lord freed us with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, awesome power by signs and portents. This biad chazaka of Izro Natuya of Moragadov Ototum of Moftiun. And so that, and then this gets played up in the Haggadah, these words, whether in Hebrew or English. Also for the farmer, the harvester here, it sounds so far off, but then more relevantly, he brought us to this land, this place, and gave us this land, a land oozing of milk and honey. Now, for this is certainly very relevant. Imagine this is Moses telling the Bnei Israel as they're about to enter the land. This is very exciting. Just this one line. This is very exciting. He already brought us to this place and gave us this land. It's aspirational for sure. It's very hopeful, because they know that. Imagine, I'm just thinking, putting myself in that mindset of the Jews hearing this from Moses, that getting very excited to enter into the land of Israel and thinking very excitedly about being able to have such harvests in our own homeland. That this must be incredibly exciting. And now this final line of this declaration that the farmer would bring, wherefore now I bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. So there's this whole historical contextualization, but it's also an appreciation of what God has not only done, but is doing, even by giving us this opportunity to then bring these first fruit, harvest the first fruits, but also then bring them to Jerusalem and bring them to the priest, which is wonderful. So, and then of course leave it before the Lord your God, and then, but then interestingly, this is really neat. Sort of what happens after this declaration, that Moses then tells the Bnei Israel, then tells the Israelites, "V'samachta b'chol hatov asher natan lecha Adonaicha uveitcha, ata v'halevi ager asher b'kirbecha." And you shall enjoy, v'samachta, that you shall rejoice, you shall enjoy, together with the Levite and the stranger in the midst, all of this, right? Everything that God has given you, but not just you, right? It's not just you alone, but also with the Levites and the stranger that's in your midst. So people who, sort of relying on your contributions, or people who are maybe more, more materially dependent and vulnerable. So, but it's not just simply, giving it up, but there's also an aspect of rejoicing. And I imagine certainly for the farmers receiving, who have received these first fruits, who are bringing this, they're also excited because they've traveled. They might be just living nearby. They could be a local, but they could have traveled from far distances, and they've made this entire trek to bring these first fruits. So you're not just going to turn around and just go home. There's this opportunity of celebrating this opportunity of, and not just being all about oneself, but also celebrating with those who are materially vulnerable. So that's what we have in this week's Torah portion. I do want to say, this is what the rabbis ultimately do. They have a bunch of laws and parameters around this, but I find this text fascinating. So this is from the Mishnah. I might have mentioned the Mishnah before, but it's from statements of the rabbis in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, and ultimately gets published probably orally by the year 200, 210 CE. And so this is a really interesting description of what that looked like, at least in the time of towards the end of the Second Temple. The flute would continue playing before them until they arrived at the Temple Mount. Once they arrived at the Temple Mount, even Agrippus the king would carry his basket on his shoulder and enter until he reached the courtyard. Once they got to the courtyard, the Levites would speak in song, "I will extol you, O Lord, because you have raised me and not allowed my enemies to rejoice over me." So it seems not just like an individual, I want to call him a Jewish farmer, but individual, you know, Jewish harvesters, I guess we could call them. It's not like it was just this individual experience, but it seemed like this would be something happening all at once, which is a really fascinating aspect. Speaking of rabbinic text, this is something later on in the 3rd century. This is from Bereshit Rabbah, which is it's a bunch of midrashim on mostly the book of Genesis. But here we have a statement from Rav Huna, who lived in the, I don't know, latter part of the 3rd century, quoting an earlier rabbi, Rav. So who taught? Okay, so Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, taught, in the merit of 3 things the world was created: the merit of Chala, of Ma'asarot, and Bikurim. So let me translate those things. Well, actually, let me finish. As it says, in the beginning, God created the sky and the land. There is no beginning other than Bikurim, as it says, the beginning of the fruits of the land. So really quick translation. I mentioned Bikurim. So that is, sorry about that. Bikurim are these first fruits. That's Bikurim. Ma'asrot are the tithes. And then Chala is not just simply the bread we have for Shabbat, but it is when we bake bread, we always set aside some of it that's meant to be not for us. So we take some aside. And the same thing. So really all 3 of these things, they're not all necessarily for us. It's things that we take away. So challah, we're supposed to take some of it. Ideally, we're supposed to give it to the priests. Nowadays, we just burn it off in a practical manner. Ma'asrot, these tithes. So these are 10 things that we give to priests, Levites, others. And Bikurim also, we're giving the first fruits and we're bringing it to the priest. So this is a really fascinating teaching. Bizchut shlosha devarim nivra ha'olam. That it was in the merit of these 3 things that the world was created. It's really, really fascinating idea here from Rav in the early to mid 3rd century. But I think what he's really, what does this really mean? It's not literally these 3 things were on these the merit of these 3 things was the world created, but it was more of saying, that world's going to be created. We're going to be making harvests, and people are also going to give and contribute and help share things around amongst others in this world, which there's a certain, you could say kind of like a tzedakah aspect or certainly an attitude that we share. And I think that really, less than the literal aspect of Rav's statement here about saying, literally there was this merit that the world was created because of these 3 things, but rather, and this goes back to these Bikurim and bringing them to Jerusalem and to the priests, but saying that we don't just take things, we don't just harvest things and just take everything for ourselves, but that there is, as I mentioned earlier, this attitude of gratitude, that we are appreciative of this land and harvests and the ability to make these things happen and for us to feed our families with, and that we also share them. And that's certainly the case here for the Bikurim, which I just find so fascinating, because in addition to bringing these first fruits to, in honor of God and bringing them to Jerusalem, giving them to the priest, but also it's not just the physical aspect, although certainly, if you are you're bringing this harvest from who knows where in Israel all the way to Jerusalem, that could be a trek in and of itself, but also making this declaration, making this statement of really an acknowledgement and contextualization of history and gratitude towards all leading up to even just these first fruits. So there's also this mindfulness of appreciation, which I think is really fascinating. So the next time we get to the Haggadah and we come across this passage, you say, I remember this. This is about the first fruits. So hopefully this also provides a contextualization for these words that we encounter in the Passover Haggadah. Before I wrap up, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge that all Jewish programming and life here at Cedar Village is through the beneficence of the Jewish Home of Cincinnati. So I want to say thank you. And with that, I want to wrap up and say Shabbat Shalom.